everybody. I hope you guys are doing great today. It's great to be able to make another video for you. I've been thinking about this for a while, and I wanted to make a video kind of refurbishing a lot of the arguments I made in the past. In a previous video titled Esoteric Stream, the Reactionary Roots Behind Anime, or something to that effect. And I wanted to refurbish and readdress some of the arguments I made in that stream in a more condensed form and with a little more detail perhaps on some areas, as well as trying to make it a shorter kind of video and without having to digress into a lot of the Shinto lore that I did digress in that video. I still recommend you guys check that out. I think a lot of the principles therein still apply, but I wanted to make a separate video today talking about why anime at its core is reactionary or traditional, and therefore it's based. I think this is a debate that is ongoing, but for me it's very clear that anime simpliciter is based. And I need to define my terms here by what I mean by anime. I think that's really important, because I'm not talking about a particular anime, any specific anime. I may allude to some specific anime in this video to draw a point or to try to make some illustration, but this is just a clarifying a demonstration. It's not, my argument doesn't rest on this, and of course there are exceptions to the argument I will make. There are animes that do not are not traditional, or are not based, or not red pilled, or anything of that sort. And when I talk about anime, I'm talking about anime simpliciter, i.e. cartoons that are made in Japan. Okay, so that's really important to understand that these are cartoons that are made in Japan. That is what I mean by anime. And the second preliminary point I need to make is I need to make it clear that I'm talking about like a relative baseness. Forgive like the poor grammar, I don't think that's a word, but I need to delimit this debate by kind of saying that this is a relative baseness. And there's no anime as based as like Passion of Christ. Or I'm not saying that anime is on the same level as like It's a Wonderful Life. Or one of these, like, you know, these icons in Western cinematography that are really have these, the ethics of it and the morals behind the story are just exceptional, and there really are these gems in Western entertainment. And obviously most of them either happen in the past or are made by film producers who are more on the fringe within the Hollywood setting. However, what I'm trying to argue today is that anime is exponentially more based than anything that's coming out of the American media scene or anything coming out of Hollywood. And my argument is quite simple. Here's how it goes. So premise one, anime is made by Japanese people and promotes Japanese culture. Pretty simple. Premise two, the Japanese are mired, consciously or unconsciously, in Shintoism, which was reflected in their social customs, norms, and values. The spiritual foundation of Japan is Shintoism, and everything flows from that. For example, kabuki theater, sumo wrestling. These things were all done in order to please the kami. Even things like taking off your shoes before entering the home, washing before you go into a hot spring. All of these norms and practices come from Shintoism. And the Japanese, to this very day, 70% of the Japanese still attend, go to the shrine at New Year's. This has a strong hold on Japanese culture, society, and their way of life. And so therefore, these values, these Shinto values, are inevitably going to be reflected in anime. So the Japanese are the ones who are making anime. Shinto is a big part of the Japanese life, and therefore Shinto is going to be reflected in anime. Now, Shinto is a traditional religion. It's not the true religion. I'm definitely not making that argument. I don't think even the Shinto devout Shintoists would say that there is some true or exclusive religion. But there is an exclusive religion, but that's not what I'm talking about today. But Shinto is a traditional religion which partakes in what you could say is this primordial truth, a perennial wisdom. In other words, the values, norms, and customs of Shintoism, we could say, are based. And therefore, if Shintoism, this customs, norms, and values that it promotes are based, anime, which is going to inevitably reflect these values, must also be based. And therefore, that is my argument. QED, anime is based. And on the flip side, the American media, because someone might say, what about the American media? We still go to church or what have you. And a lot of Americans still do that. on Easter and Christmas at least, and so you could say it's still kind of a part of our culture is Christianity, though I would definitely say to a lesser extent now than it was in the past, specifically in the United States. But the American media is produced by people who are not part of the traditional American stock, to say the least. And so given that this group of people who are foreign to American identity is running the American media, running Hollywood, they're going to promote values that are alien to the things that we stand for. Alright, so now back to Japan. So we can see that in the American side of things, there is a group that has a hegemonic control in the media in Hollywood, does not represent or is not mired in our values, is cringe, it is not base. Okay, now back to Japan. I think the premise that needs to be motivated, the premise that really needs to be solidified, is the relationship Shinto has in anime and the primordial foundations of Shintoism. So I want to explore those kind of avenues of inquiry. All religions speak of all great, like by great I mean religions that have subsisted since the primordial era. Let's talk about this like archetypal state of humanity. A perfect state where the law of God is transmitted directly to humans. For us Christians, this is Adam and Eve. As they were in the garden, they shared this perfect relationship with God. And this is like their golden era. In Shinto, they have a similar idea, and this is manifested in the celestial progenitors of the Japanese race. The Kami Izanagi and Izanami, who were born from the descendants of the sun Kami Amaterasu. I'm not going to go into all the lore. I talked about it in the previous stream. But basically, a kami is like the perfect form, like you would have in Platonism. So they had like the perfect form of like fire, or the perfect form of something, like a waterfall. And then they add this spiritual and mystic element to it, while also anthropomorphizing it. That's probably the best way to describe a kami. It's not like a demigod, or it's not like a spirit, so to speak. It's like they take something that's like a platonic form, something that's beautiful, and they think that there's some essence of it that is perfect, and then, or that reflects the nature of beauty, and then they anthropomorphize it, and then they add some mystic element to it. And all these kami come from what is called the Ame no Minakanushi no Kami, the god who is in the center of heaven. And it's like this unmoved mover. He's the only kami who engenders himself. All the other principles on which the kami rely are engendered from some previous kami. Whereas the Ame no Minakanushi no Kami is this like unmoved mover. Perhaps initially in the tradition, the Ame no Minakanushi no Kami had a more important role. As time went on, and there's this involution of the tradition, it kind of moves away from him and more into this a pantheon of kamis. Regardless, no doubt we can see that there is, in the sense, the logos, in the sense that it does exist in everyone in its like aboriginal state. In the sense we're all made in the image of God, we can see this reflected even in these pagan religions. And it's interesting that St. Augustine thought all perfect forms, all the Platonic forms exist in the mind of God, and they come from God. And so you can see already this Platonic kind of philosophy that exists in Shintoism in kind of this veiled form. So in the beginning, man began his archetypal state from which we have degenerated from, evolved from. And so in this state, knowledge that was learned has been passed down in symbols and in myths. And so the knowledge of a unmoved mover was undoubtedly passed down to whoever was the progenitors of the Japanese race in forms of myth and legend, but it has since devolved into some other religion. This is what we call the perennial tradition. I think people often forget that the guy who wrote Genesis, Moses, his creation story was an oral retelling. It was an oral retelling from previous generations before him, from the other Israelites coming all the way from Abraham. And so this oral retelling is the basis on which all of these traditional societies are formed, and the oral retelling originates in the Garden of Eden. It originates in that archetypal state, and then it gets dispersed throughout the world, and these myths and these other forms, symbolism. Rene Guénon wrote a whole book called Science of the Sacred Symbolism. something to that effect, in which he explores that idea. And so the Israelites don't have like a monopoly on this primordial truth. What they have a monopoly on was that they were the people in which God had reinvoked or refurbished that truth in them through direct revelation, and then later the consummation of all of this typology, all of this symbolism was in Christ, the incarnate Logos, who fulfilled everything that had come before him in terms of like sacrifice, in terms of the enmity between God and man. He was the one who redeemed all of that. Alright, so I don't want to go too much into all those ideas. Those are kind of broad concepts of what is tradition, but I'm trying to make it clear that Shintoism shares in this symbolic transmission of truth. And so we can say that it's not a true religion, while at the same time saying that there are aspects of it that are undoubtedly true. And so I can go into another video about what is this called the perennial wisdom, or the Sophia Perennis, that it shares. But obviously Christianity is the fullness of this truth. It is the only religion in which Christ himself, God himself, has revitalized and re-energized the revelation as it's generated in all its other forms. But that's not for this video. Today I want to explain the values of Shintoism, which you will be undeniably able to recognize in whatever animes you like, and be able to see that these had like a traditional origin. The first is gender hierarchy. Even in the very beginning, Izanami and Izanagi, it was the female who brings in chaos into the world. She is sentenced to hell because she gives birth to the fire kami, and it's an abomination. And so Izanami is thrown into hell for this, and it kind of represents that this state was destroyed because of the actions of Izanami. And we see in Japan, obviously, a very strong sense of gender hierarchy. The caste system is another thing, and I'll go into more detail about how this relates to civic life. But we see very strongly that there's the emperor, the priest caste, and then you have the shogunate, and then you have the warrior caste, the samurai, you have serfs. So we see something very similar in the feudal Japan, as you would see in Hindu culture or in feudal European culture, something that again shows us this hierarchical society. And a hierarchical society is one that is going to resemble the celestial society in heaven. Everything in heaven is hierarchical. The angels have a hierarchy. God, of course, is at the very pinnacle on top of this hierarchy. And so the world around us should likewise try to resemble a hierarchical world. There's respect for elders and those kind of values that exist in Shintoism. They believe that they took care of us when we were younger, and so it is our responsibility to take care of our elders when we are of age. But what is especially interesting about Shintoism is that it is kind of the lifeblood of Japan. It is the principle on which Japan is founded, both as a nation and as a people, as a race, in the same way that Christendom was founded on Christianity, in the same way that Christianity represents this building block, this cornerstone on which Christendom is established, in which people's identity in Christendom was Christianity, more so than it was the king or the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, more so than any of that was the religion of Catholicism during the early to high Middle Ages. And the same is true of Japan insofar as Shintoism is this grounding principle. In the book that I have here, called Shinto, the Kami Way, it's a great book to explore Shinto practices, lore, etc. One of the quotes, it says that, quote, "The spiritual basis for government and society, in a sense, they were identical. Consequently, it was but natural that Shinto was made the official cult of the new government." End quote. By new government, it was referring to the Meiji Restoration, in which Emperor Meiji wanted to restore Japan to its traditional roots. And so we see here that the government and Shintoism are very much intertwined and much interlocked. It says, quote, the book says, quote, "The new government demonstrated the establishment of the principle of the unity of Shinto worship and government, which has been regarded from time immemorial as one of the fundamental concepts and spiritual foundation of Japanese society." End quote. The spiritual foundation of Japanese society is Shintoism. And this is infinitely more valuable, infinitely more admirable than the foundation on which we are currently established. Our society is established on materialism. It is established on the principles that come from the bourgeoisie, the people, the ruling caste is basically the Vaishyas or the merchant caste, and so the economic principles on which we are grounding society, things like GDP, these material principles don't hold a candlestick to transcendental principles that Japan was founded on, and to this day still kind of recognized, though it's kind of more in adumbrations. Again, there was no idea of separation of church and state. This is liberal idea that developed in the Enlightenment, that there's a separation between the church, the religion, and the state, that they exist in two separate spheres, and this is obviously an illusion, and I've talked about that before, and Shinto recognizes, it's always recognized this. The emperor, who was the figurehead, the head of the nation, he was a ritualist. The emperor, who had these roots to the kami, who came down in lineage from the kami, I believe from the rice kami in particular, and then the rice kami from Amaterasu, was a ritualist. That was their goal, is to remind the people that their identity was in Shintoism. And this is what the book says about it. Quote, "Government meant the guidance of society in the cooperative performance of kami rites, which it was believed would produce communal tranquility." In other words, the religion was a part of the communal development and establishing this a society that is grounded in a cohesive society, is grounded in something that is spiritual and transcendent. And whenever the emperor was initiated, he would always go through some religious ceremony. There's always a religious ceremony. And so basically, in other words, the priest caste was always the head of the society. And this used to be the case for Europe. Europe used to have a priest caste, the Pope, who was the head of society, insofar as he was not the temporal leader, but he could establish peace treaties, he could judge the temporal realm. He had two swords. If a civic leader was not acting virtuously, doing his job, he was judged by the Pope, by the magisterium of the church. And then they were also the ones who consecrated and initiated emperors and kings through the process of coronation, to receive the mandate from heaven, or you could say the divine right, that came from the priestly caste. There's this recognition of a vertical hierarchy, and this is not a qualitative sense. This is a qualitative hierarchy in which the priest caste is the one who is most pure, one closest to God, and therefore they're the ones who are at the top. And then we descend downward from how close the various other castes are to the metaphysical principles that govern our society. And indeed, Shintoism is also, unlike Christianity, is very much intertwined with nationalism and a racial identity. There's really a strong sense of racial identity and nationalism that comes with Shintoism that makes it very inaccessible to foreigners. Here's another quote from the book. Quote, "It was only natural that Shinto, which had a close relationship with the imperial family and had experienced oppression and even absorption by Buddhism and Confucianism," in other words, that there was these forces from the Occident and from China of Buddhism and Confucianism that was pushing against Japan, the book says, "should become the spiritual basis for the preservation and independence of the racial culture and the protection of the country from alien domination." Let me read that again. "It was only natural that Shinto, due to these factors, should become the spiritual basis for the preservation and independence of the racial culture." How often do we hear people talk about the preservation of racial culture and the spiritual basis on which we should have a sense of preservation of our racial heritage and culture? This is something that's very anathema in our current climate, or at least for white people, it would be anathema to say that we want to preserve our heritage and preserve our nation as it once existed from alien domination. And yet this is something that is very clear and self-evident in Japan. They've always understood this, and this, to this very day, they're very, you could say, hesitant to welcome in immigrants. And again, this is like probably one of the last lines in the book. It says, quote, "Shinto is a racial religion. It is inextricably intertwined with the fabric of Japanese customs and ways of thinking. It is impossible to separate it from communal and national life of the people." End quote. It is impossible to separate Shinto from the Japanese people. It is a racial religion, and that, I think, can resonate with a lot of my viewers and a lot of my listeners. This idea that that it's there to preserve and protect the identity of the Japanese people. So there's some of the interesting aspects of Shintoism that are, you could see the juxtaposition and similarities with early Christianity as it existed in Europe, and is very much juxtaposed, though, to our current and materialistic climate that we exist in, this very secular climate. There are three virtues in Shintoism, and these, I think, are most clearly demonstrated in anime. I don't think in anime you may see some things about racial like preservation or identity or nationalism that might exist in some animes, like Saga of Tanya the Evil or something like that. But I think the virtues of Shintoism especially are very much intertwined with anime. For example, the first one is truth or wisdom, and this is always symbolized in a mirror. Amaterasu was always pictured with a mirror. She gave a mirror to the first Jimmu Tenno, the first emperor of Japan. She gave a mirror to him, so that every time he'd see the mirror, he would see himself, and therefore see that he was made in the image of the kami. And the mirror represents purity and sincerity. The mirror always shows you who you are. It doesn't lie to you, it doesn't sugarcoat things. If you have a blemish, it shows the blemish. And so, in a sense, it represents that this need for purity and also sincerity and honesty. And that is why honesty is always a virtue I think we see in anime, but particularly innocence and purity is something that we see a lot, particularly as this relates to cleanliness. This is something that Japanese society in general has really latched onto, is a cleanliness. Their streets are clean. Anime, you can see that everything is very orderly. In particular, they take off their shoes before entering the home, things like this. And in the way that people dress, the women are very feminine. The features are emphasized that make them look more cute or more innocent, like the large eyes, or the small lips, or the small nose. These are there, or the school uniforms, the long stockings, the dresses. They're all there in order to again highlight the feminine nature of anime girls and the innocence of them. You see this, I think, really, this is why K-On! I think is so popular among some of my viewers, is for that very reason. It's like, instead of trying to highlight the women being masculine, or women trying to take the role of men, as we see with this late stage feminism, instead in Japan they want to highlight the beauty and ethereal natural nature that women have, and this is shown in anime. And the same can be true of men. Men are shown to be masculine, competent, smart, supposed to be virtuous and upstanding citizens, role models. Another virtue is courage or strength. I think you see this a lot in shonen animes. Men need to be brave, they need to be smart. The Bushido Code, which is something that I think is very much a part of Japanese culture, even to this day. The Bushido Code said that a samurai should be cold like his sword, but he should never forget the fire whence it was forged. In other words, a samurai needs to be exercise strength through courtesy. He has to protect the weak. That is his job in society. Is really much a duty-driven occupation. And the best example of this would be undoubtedly Demon Slayer. I don't want to give out too many spoilers, but Demon Slayer in the movie Rengoku, he has this beautiful monologue, or a beautiful rather flashback, in which his mother reminds him of his place because of his place in the caste as a warrior. His mom reminds him that his strength is there to protect other people. And I will have to do a whole video just on Demon Slayer. There's so much in there. There's so much rich perennial values. There's so much rich virtue that is intertwined in that anime. And to do a deep dive to explicate that all will take a lot more time than I have in this video. Finally, charity or compassion is the last of the three, you could say, cardinal virtues of Shintoism. And this might surprise people. I think pagans are often come across as not being charitable or not being compassionate. That's seen as kind of like a Christian virtue, whereas the pagans were more like warriors that were strong and they fought hard. And this is kind of soft and milk toast or something like that, but that's not at all the case. Japan, charity and compassion is very much a virtue that is very well and alive in their society to this day. The idea that your society is like a family and that we should care for the downtrodden, that if someone's in need, that you should help them. You see this all the time in slice of life animes. I think especially when it shows like the nice guy in anime, the guy who is respectful to people, the guy who is upstanding. He's the one who always is the protagonist, and he's always the one who like girls like. The guy who's not the guy who's mean or aggressive, but rather the guy who's nice and gentle. And then the question is now, so I think I've demonstrated now how you can see why Shintoism is traditional, and Shintoism has these values that we can predicate to as being based. And now you can see how Shintoism might overflow into anime. The influence of Shintoism on Japan has influenced anime, and anime being Japanese cartoons made by the Japanese is going to reflect this. Now, but what about exceptions? Undoubtedly, there's exceptions. There's going to be Kumers in any society, and so you're going to have degenerate animes that have over-the-top fan service, things like this. Obviously, don't endorse those. But what about something like Yuri? And this is something that has kind of always been like my optics wars. For other people, their optics wars were against Reaganites. For myself and my community, the optics wars is always against the Yuri crowd or the Ori crowd, or some of maybe the high school DxD crowd, something like that, hentai. That is our optics wars, is always to fight against those kind of things. And what's so interesting, and this is something I learned recently in a class I took about anime, is that Yuri is unlike in the West, where homosexual relationships are, one, very sexualized, and two, they're like forced upon us by the media and the elites in order to accept them. Yuri was not like that at all. Yuri started as this it was only one romantic intimacy. It was never sexual, and it was created by girls who were in these all-girls schools, and so they had no interaction with other men, interestingly enough. So they had no interaction with other men, and so they had these very much intimate relationships with other girls that were, again, not sexual at all. And there was this expectation that even if they had this relationship, they would get married afterwards. There was always this expectation that in society, your place as a woman was to be married and to be serve the husband and serve in the household. That was always the case, even within the context of Yuri. And by the way, I don't endorse Yuri even as it stands, like I'm saying, but I'm just saying to qualify it and to give it the sense that it's not the same as the bourgeois values that come from the media entertainment we have in the West. It's not the same. There is a qualitative difference between the Yuri and those type of things in Japan and as they exist in the United States. There is a difference. I imagine over time there will be more Occidental influence on Japan, and so maybe we'll see a shift. I pray that's not going to be the case. At least we know that the animes in the past and the animes that are kind of being produced right now, for the most part, are pretty well based and have been, again, mired in this traditional culture. But I think we can reasonably say that Shintoism, simpliciter, as it is grounded as a traditional religion, which is, again, has intermingled itself with Japanese life and culture, has also found its way into anime, and therefore anime is based. Anime is reactionary, and you can't change my mind otherwise, and I'm willing to debate or to dialogue with anyone who disagrees on this point. And I think anime should not only be tolerated within any kind of right-wing movement, but should be used as a catalyst and a vehicle in order to red pill people, because people naturally are reactionary. People are naturally hierarchical in their understanding. That is their primordial nature. And so the more we can, and it is the sinful nature of man that that tries to obfuscate this. And so the more we can show people anime and then explain to people the reason why they like Demon Slayer is because the male character is a male, not because the male character is some intersectional identity, but rather that he is strong, courageous, and compassionate. If we can explain that these perennial virtues exist therein, we can, I think, win a lot more Zoomers and young people who are interested in anime and interested in these foreign kinds of entertainment. So thank you guys for listening. I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know if you have any questions. I'd love to hear what you guys have to think about this. Make sure to put them in the comment section below. Make sure to subscribe and support the channel. I really appreciate that. And I'll see you guys all in the next video.